Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoomina from UC San Diego. Today is March 24th in California, which makes it March 25th in Japan. Ohayo gozaimasu. I'm Ulrike Schede, professor and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology here at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. And as I just mentioned, our guest today is Professor James Raymo. It's March 24th, and our topic is family change in Japan, a demographic perspective. Before we start our conversation, let me just tell you a little bit about ourselves while the audience, which is sizable today, is still finding its Zoom seats. So this finds you at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We have over 40 faculty at our school and 12 research centers. We offer a large number of degrees, one of which is a Master of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If that sounds of interest, please look us up at gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center. We do a lot of fun things, including, of course, this Zoominar. Our website is jfit.ucsd.edu. Our events are recorded, so that has two implications. One, today your image will not be shown, but if you have a question, by all means, please type it into the Q&A box. I will not refer to you by name unless you specifically instruct me to. And also, I can send all your questions to Professor Raymo tomorrow. The second is that means we have a list of recordings of former Zoominars, and the place where we put those is either our YouTube channel or our JZ gallery, which is at jfit.ucsd.edu. And this is a recurring event. So coming up to after today, in April is Andrew McDermott, who is a private equity investor in Japan. And we want to discuss whether private equity investments that are coming in large numbers to Japan are helpful or actually value destructing. And in the future, we'll have innovation in Japanese history. We have a political science, a grand strategy presentation, venture capital, and many more coming up. Please stay tuned. And with that, let me introduce my guest today. There he is, Professor Jim Raymo in Princeton. Hello, hello.
Thank you for having me.
So Jim Raymo is the Henry Wendt III, 55, Professor of East Asian Studies and Professor of Sociology at Princeton University. He is also the director of the Princeton University of Tokyo Strategic Partnership. He holds a BA in economics, Colgate University, and an MA from Osaka University. And then he saw the light very early on in his life and became a sociologist with a PhD from the University of Michigan. His PhD thesis was about spouse selection and marriage timing in Japan. So he's been looking at this topic that we're going to discuss today for several decades. Before joining Princeton, Jim was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he is to this day and has been a visiting scholar at many universities and research institutes in Japan, including the Tokyo College at the University of Tokyo. Jim teaches methods in sociology, demography, and so forth and so on. And so I want to explain briefly, Jim. So demographics mean you're looking at large data sets to identify ongoing trends in Japanese society. Right? And so Jim has many publications in things, of course, the American Journal of Sociology and the American Sociological Review, but also the Journal of Marriage and Family, the Journal of Gerontology, a journal called Demography, and so forth and so on. So, Jim, I thought I would count all your papers, and I thought that would take forever. So I'll not do that. So thank you. And here you are. Thank you for joining me today, Jim.
Thank you so much for having me, Ulrika. This is a real pleasure to be here. Should I
Yeah, why don't
share?
why don't you start us off with some of your findings? That can be the basis of
Okay, I'm sorry, but I seem to have lost my where's my share now? That's not it.
The Zoom seems to be a little bit wonky today. I just had the same problem, actually.
Oh, here it is. I'm sorry.
Okay.
The things change so often. No, that's not it, is it?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So now you just have to turn the show.
Okay.
There you go. Okay.
Okay.
Promising.
I'm, after what, 30 years of doing this, I still haven't figured it out. But at any rate, as I said, thank you so much for having me. I've been to several of these on the other side, the hidden side, in the audience, and it's a real pleasure to have a chance to share some thoughts about what I do. Thank you for the very kind introduction. I appreciate that. I've been doing this for 30 years or so, not because I'm in a rut or because I don't have the capacity to think of anything new, but rather because demographic change has happened so dramatically in Japan that there's always something else to focus on. And hopefully I can give our audience today a little bit of a taste of the kind of things that are central to the research that I do and people around me do. I really look forward to questions. I think that demography is something that I think we see discussed on a daily basis. Certainly, if you read papers in Japan or on Japan, it's hard to find a newspaper in Japan that doesn't at least have one article on a demographic issue every day. But Ulrika actually asked me to start out with a little bit of background about just what is demography. I think that's a really good idea because, again, even though I think most of us have a good sense of what it is, it's a pretty minor discipline. Relatively, it doesn't have a high degree of visibility as a discipline, even if what we study has a high degree of visibility. And this is actually particularly true in Japan, which is kind of odd, given that Japan has so many pressing demographic issues. Now, I would argue it's the most pressing domestic policy issue in Japan. So this is just this is the homepage of the place that I spend a lot of my time working. Most of my colleagues in Japan are based or were based here, the National Institute of Population and Social Security Research. It's an independent research unit affiliated with the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare. And they do a lot of things, research being primary, but the two that I've circled are the population projections. This is the unit that's responsible for producing the official Japanese population projections that are used in policy discussions, such as determination of public pension benefit levels and things along these lines. And the circle to the right is indicating the various large-scale population representative surveys that this institute conducts. I think if you see any reference to changing marriage behavior, fertility behavior, attitudes about family, very often it's based on the surveys that this institute conducts and that I've been using for many years. So that's just a little bit of background. Happy to talk more about the discipline, but I thought I would jump right in with something that I know everybody knows, everybody in the audience. I think, registering to listen to me talk probably indicates some knowledge of basic demographic trends. This just shows between 1960 and 2065, that's the projections I just mentioned, produced by the National Institute. The blue line is the total population. You can see Japan is already shrinking. We know this. The vertical dotted line, that's today. By the middle of the century, Japan will be about the same size it was in 1960, about 90 million. And the red line is just an arbitrary measure of population aging, the percent of the population age 65 and over. That's on the right vertical axis. I think most of us are aware that Japan is the oldest large country in the world right now, and is facing all of the policy issues that come with that. Japan actually is the oldest large country in the history of humanity, as far as we know, but won't be for very long. It will soon be passed by Korea. But nonetheless, Japan is sort of at the forefront of these changes. And this isn't really what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about present this just to provide some background. I want to talk about what underlies these changes, the changes in family behavior that underlie these changes. So as Ulrika kindly mentioned, I teach and have taught for many years classes on demographic methods, demographic issues. And one of the first things I ask when we start talking about population aging, I ask students, what makes populations get older? And of course, they say people live longer, and they're not wrong. That's part of it, but they're not really right either, because that's by far not the largest part. The largest part is absolutely this: declining fertility. Populations get older, they get top heavy, not because people live longer, but because fewer children are born, and the bottom of the pyramid becomes more narrow. And Japan, again, is at the absolute forefront of fertility change. It doesn't have the lowest fertility rate in the world. That also belongs to Korea, but South Korea, that is. But what I've shown here is between 1950 and roughly the present, 2022, the total fertility rate. We can talk about what that means, but it's the measure that you're all familiar with: the number of children on average under a bunch of assumptions that a woman would be expected to have in her lifetime. Massive decline right after World War II, stable around so-called replacement level of about 2. But starting in the early 1970s, right around the oil shock time, you can see this steady decline. And what's really unique here about Japan is 50 years, half a century, the total fertility rate has been below the replacement level. That is why Japan is the oldest country in the world. That is why Japan is declining at about 800,000, 700,000, 800,000 people per year. And understanding what underlies this is really the basis of what I do and many of the people around me do. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, focusing particularly on family change. When I ask my students, second question I ask, what causes fertility to decline? And of course, the first answer they say is that people have less kids, people have fewer kids. And of course, that's correct. But it's also not a complete answer, because if you look at the newspapers and you read about the pronatalist policies that Japan has been actively investing tons of money in over the past couple of decades, you will see that much of them focus on supporting married couples in having the number of children they want. And the policies that are part of that broader policy agenda, yeah, they're wonderful. Nobody's going to sort of say these are policies we don't want. They're excellent, in terms of making life easier for couples. But the real thing that I want to highlight is that married couples aren't having fewer children, at least not until recently. Conditional on marriage, Japanese couples have long had about 2 children. That's what this slide shows. The bottom, the sort of bars represent birth cohorts of women. So women born way back in the 1920s to women born in the late 60s, so a little bit younger than me. There's a little bit of a decline here. And one of the things that I'm working on with colleagues right now is emerging evidence of even further decline in this. But the point that I really want to make here is that this is not why fertility has been low for 50 years in Japan. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because that's where the family change part comes in. This is my obligatory cartoon that I like to show, a little bit of Chibi Maruko-chan for everybody here. And the reason that I put this here is because this is an audience of people interested in Japan and with an understanding of Japan. So maybe it's a little bit unnecessary. I certainly don't present this when I present in Japan, but I do regularly show something like this when I present in the United States or Europe, because I think people's understandings or impressions of what Japanese families look like have not kept up with what actual families look like in Japan. You have your 2 children, happily, stably married couple, breadwinner, homemaker type arrangement, the housewife living in a 3-generation household. Yes, these families still exist in Japan, but increasingly are becoming a pretty rare arrangement. And the processes underlying the sort of dwindling of this kind of family are really what are at the core of the changes that I'm talking about with respect to fertility and by extension, population aging and decline. So let me talk a little bit more about that. Um, Mean age at first marriage, women red, men blue, 1980 to the present. Women married about age 30 on average, first time, men about 31. This is not late in the grander scheme of things. Many countries are very similar, but it does mean that fertility, childbearing is being pushed to later ages. And it does mean that concerns about the ability to achieve the desired number of children are emerging. We have a paper coming out pretty soon on the use of assisted reproductive technology in Japan, and its role in fertility. So this is one piece of it, but this is not the biggest piece. This is the biggest piece. This is trends in lifelong singlehood. So these are the proportions of women red, men blue, who are not married at age 50. So of course people marry after age 50, but statistically it's about zero. Um, so what we have here is currently, or 5, 6 years ago, about a quarter of men and about 15% of women never marrying. It's going to be closer to 27, 28% for men, 20% for women. This is unprecedented in Japan, and this is really important for fertility because unlike many countries, including the US and pretty much all of Europe, there's almost no childbearing outside of marriage. So these people are not going to have children throughout their lives. So this means a slightly higher level of increase in lifelong childlessness. So maybe roughly 30% of men, 22, 3% of women are projected to never have children in Japan. This is why fertility is low and will continue to be low in the future. So here's just a figure showing Japan in comparative perspective here. About 2% of children are born to unmarried mothers, compared to 30, 40% in the US, higher in some European countries. So this is why later and less marriage in particular are so critically important, and why many of us argue that the policies that are targeting married couples should also be targeting unmarried couples, not unmarried couples, unmarried people who would like to marry and form families. And I think that's a little bit of a blind spot in the policy arena, at least with respect to pronatalist policies. So very quickly, I said in the little blurb about this talk that I wanted to talk about divorce and remarriage. If not marrying is important for understanding fertility, I think it's really, and this is well studied. I think many people are well aware of this and have many papers have been written on this. But at the same time, if marriage is not taking place outside, I'm sorry, if childbearing is not taking place outside of marriage, we also need to think about other aspects of marriage, including divorce. To the extent that divorce is associated with limited childbearing, this is critically important to understand the implications of rising divorce rates in Japan for overall levels of fertility, among many other things. And these are just a couple of papers. The left is one I wrote 22 years ago now. We're actually in the process of writing an update of this paper that I'll present in a couple of months at a conference in the US. And the right is a paper by my colleague Miho Iwasawa, who is probably Japan's leading expert on these issues. I won't go into the details because I can see my time ticking away a little bit here. We can talk more about this later. But the one on the left basically shows that there's been a steady increase in divorce over time. These are cumulative divorce probabilities. So roughly, you can see for more recent marriage cohorts, roughly, say 1990 marriage cohort, roughly 20% of marriages ended in divorce by the 12th year of marriage. And this dotted line at the top is a kind of a different kind of measure. You often hear that half of marriages in the United States end in divorce. That's this kind of measure, and we found that about 30% of marriages in Japan end in divorce. And it turns out that that was a little bit of an overstatement because the data we used were from the year 2002, where divorce rates actually peaked. So it's a little bit less than that. It's about 25% right now. A quarter of marriages in Japan end in divorce. And the one on the right shows Miho Iwasawa's work. The small circle on the left here shows that about 26%, 25%, 26% of women born in 1970 had ever divorced by the age of 45. So divorce is quite common in Japan. This is the same as most European countries. Obviously, it's lower than the US, but pretty much everywhere is lower than the US. Here's something that I think is also um, extremely understudied as a potential um, demographic change related to fertility, related to the kinds of things we care about when we're worried about low rates of fertility, population aging, and that is remarriage. This basically shows from 1980 to the present the proportion of marriages that involve at least one formerly married spouse. And you can see that in Japan, a quarter of all marriages involve at least one formerly married spouse. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say that the old vision of family, sort of nicely depicted in the Chibi Maruko-chan cartoon, is really, yes, those families exist, as I said, but there's a lot more heterogeneity, variation in family patterns of family formation, family dissolution, and so on, with implications for a range of outcomes that we care about. So I think I'm going to stop right there, just in terms of giving a little bit of background. Here's one more. Can I do one more, Ulrika? Yeah. Okay. Here's one more. This is a paper that we hope will come out soon. And basically, what we tried to do in this paper is to quantify the impact of remarriage and divorce on overall fertility rates. So don't worry so much about the actual numbers. These are different measures than what I showed you before. But the black ones are the observed fertility rates for women born in the early 60s, so on, to the late 70s. And you can see that those black bars go down. Fertility has decreased. We know that. But the other ones, the gray and the white, are sort of what we would call counterfactual or hypothetical scenario fertility rates that would be observed in a counterfactual world in which divorce, the gray, were eliminated. In a kind of statistical way, and the white, remarriage, were eliminated. So just take a look at the white, for example, the white bars. In 1975-79, the white bar is about 0.1 lower than the observed black bar, the black level, which means that in the absence of remarriage, the fertility rate would have been about 0.1 lower. And you might think 0.1, that's nothing, that's tiny. But if you imagine the amount of money, time, effort, investment that has been put into trying to raise the total fertility rate by that much, it hasn't raised it by that much, but if it were able to raise it by that much, I think the government would be extremely happy and touting the successes of their fertility policies. So it's just a matter of how you look at things. But this is something that we try to understand by leveraging the kind of data that we have access to. So I'll stop here, and hopefully this is some food for thought and discussion. So thanks for listening.
Thanks. That's fantastic. We already have questions coming, but I'm gonna
Yeah.
ask you if you want to stop this so that people
Stop.
can see.
Yeah.
Oh, there you
Yeah.
go. Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent.
Hmm.
So I have two things. The first is
Yep.
I was teaching class on Japanese business, and of course the bubble burst in
Hmm.
1991, and then comes this very interesting phenomenon of the Ice Age generation.
Yes. Yes.
Refers to people born in 1980 and 1985 and after
Yep.
that
Yeah.
kind of
Hmm.
graduated from university into
Hmm.
this serious
Yes.
recession and then therefore could not become organization people. And because they were not salaryman, they could not marry. And therefore they Like, you see this problem. So in your data, do you see
Mhm.
that? Is the
Yeah,
Ice Age phenomenon
yeah,
the big
yeah,
not getting married trigger? And then in
yeah,
Korea, it would have been the financial crisis, I guess, the Asian financial
yeah,
crisis of 80,
exactly.
97, 98.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a great question, and I will I want to give credit where credit is due. So I will, rather than reference my own work, reference two studies that address exactly this. I don't know if you've come across. There's a recent book that's by a colleague of mine who's won. It's the book has won several awards. It's a small Chuo Shinsho book,
Yeah.
and the focus is it's 150 pages of exactly this, sort of tracing the life experiences of the so-called Ice Age cohorts. And it's clear, yes, that they are less likely to have ever married, less likely to have children. And a couple of things that really emerge from this that I think are fundamentally important for people like me, who are interested in the intersection of sort of family and demographic change and inequality, and the Japanese government, who is interested in, ensuring some kind of minimum safety net for people who are sort of at the margins, if you will. And it's really clear from the work. I should mention her name. This is a woman named Ayako Kondo. She's
Mhm.
a economist at the University of Tokyo and has done some really cool work on these issues related to the Ice Age cohort or generation, whatever you want to call it. And the thing that really stands out, and this is no surprise to you, but I'm just going to sort of reiterate what I think you already know, and that is, many people in the Ice Age cohort did just fine, but they're the ones who didn't are the ones who ended up in the non-standard employment tracks, without any access, as you said, to sort of the corporate um, uh, safety net. And there's this real bifurcation in family trajectories that is clear from all kinds of data that I've worked with, data that Kondo-san and others have put forth in their work, that demonstrates that really this cohort is where this bifurcation really started, and as a result of the labor market bifurcation. Yeah,
So we
it's
have already some great questions coming in, but I want to
mhm.
ask my second one, and then
Sure,
well, there are lots of other questions about why and how this happens. So no
sure.
kids outside marriage. I
Yes.
remember vividly there was a PhD student several years ago who at the Association of Asian Studies gave this excellent talk about,
Mhm.
this would have been 15 years ago, 20 years ago, so about how women who have, for whatever reason, kids outside marriage often have a whole slew of problems. It has something to do with the koseki and the last name and and all of
Mhm.
the registration. And often, according to this particular person's research, this ended up with the grandparents adopting the child so that it
Mhm.
would be, not look as if it was out of wedlock. Has that, first of all,
Yeah.
I assume that was true, but has that
Yeah.
changed at all? I mean, is it easier
Mhm.
now to have to as a
Um,
single woman decide that I want to have children, I'm going to have children?
yeah. I don't think it's changed. That may have been Katja Hertog, perhaps. I'm not sure who it was, but she wrote some nice work on that. I'm blanking on another person who's written really good work on this. A colleague. I'm embarrassed that I'm getting old. I can't remember names as well as I used to. Um, but the issues, yes, there are issues around koseki. Um, the point you raised about adoption, this is something that I'm really interested in, but I don't know any way to actually ascertain this. Maybe with the individual vital statistics record, the birth registration records, we could look at this. Um, that is, parents registering themselves as the mothers registering themselves as the parent rather than their daughter. So taking the grandchild as their own. I've run this by a few people who think who said they think I'm crazy, but I don't think I'm crazy at all. I think that this actually does happen. And it doesn't have to be grandmothers or mothers, siblings, sisters as well, may be a source of sort of a side door into non-marital childbearing. But I think that that probably isn't the biggest picture or the most important part of the story. The most important part of the story is really, as you're suggesting, the difficulties that are associated with becoming a single mother. And I think there's two things that we know from the data, we know from the research. One is that single mothers in Japan, almost all of whom are divorced mothers, and maybe a little bit different from unmarried mothers, have among the highest poverty rates in the OECD. Yeah. So it is not easy, and there are various reasons for that, but it is not easy financially and therefore emotionally, in terms of time, in terms of parenting, to be a single mother in Japan. But the other one that I think is really quite interesting to me is based on qualitative research, and I'll share the book with you later. But basically, the conclusion was that many women who are pregnant outside of marriage, based on the interviews, know the guy, the father, is not going to be a good husband, not going to be a good father, but they think that it is unfair to the yet born child to not have a father in the home, in the family. And that really was quite striking. I don't know how well that generalizes, but we don't have large scale population level data that would allow us to evaluate that in any way. But we do know that so-called shotgun marriages, I hate that term, dekichatta kekkon in Japanese, or um, uh, marriages subsequent to pregnancy, are more likely to end in divorce than are others. So yeah, just a little bit of background.
So that leads to actually the questions that are coming in. So
Mm,
Clay asks a question that I was going to ask, which is
yeah.
um, separation or
Mm,
beccio without legal
Bekyo.
is a common phenomenon.
Yeah.
Is that accounted for? And the question is that accounted for in the
Mm,
divorce rate? And I don't think so. But I
yeah.
always thought there
Yeah.
was a lot of tatemai going on, that there were actually marriages that are not that great, but because of all of these problems with the children and the standing and
Yeah.
the ijime and the PTA and and all of that stuff, that people would remain
Yeah.
married but actually not be. But how do we? I mean,
Yeah.
and that would have an impact on fertility because people would not have either a first child or
Right.
a second
Right.
child.
Right. So this is a great question, and there are many ways to take this, but I'll be direct and answer the question that was asked. So in research on divorce, not in Japan, but anywhere, um, we can measure divorce in two ways. We can measure divorce in terms of legal divorce, the point at which, if and when a divorce registration was filed in the Japanese case, the rikon toroke, and the other being when I think the question is asked something like this: when did you stop living as a couple, or something like that? And it's separation, basically, and that can be bekkyo, it could be katei nai rikon, the living together as divorced, or divorced under the same roof. And those are things that we can actually capture in the data, not using the vital statistics data, which is registration data, but using the large scale survey data that I mentioned at the very outset. So we can actually calculate divorce rates for the two measures. It's not that big a difference, to be quite honest. And I'm so one thing that may be suggested, may that the question may suggest, is that there are a lot of very unhappy marriages that one might say are qualitatively no different than divorce, and that we cannot capture. But Baekgyo separation we can capture, and it's not zero, but it's not enough to sort of alter our understanding of the general trends and patterns in divorce.
So there's a
Yeah,
related question, which is
yeah.
David's, and I had that too. Over this period of time that you're studying, has divorce become easier? Or
Um,
it's no fault, or it's kind of
yeah,
whatever the financial
yeah.
sides are. Or I heard, I'm no expert in divorce, and so I don't know, but I heard that in Japan the woman has the final say on this. If she doesn't
No,
agree, then that's not true. Okay, so
I don't think so. Yeah. I mean, I think easy, it depends on what the dimension you're looking at is. You just mentioned several reasons why divorce is not easy at all. Children, I've mentioned the economic implications for women, but in terms of the legal part, the legal process of divorcing, I can't imagine there's an easier country in the world to divorce than Japan. You both stamp the Rikon Toroke and take it and submit it, and you're divorced. And the vast majority of divorces in Japan, I don't have the number. It's over 85 to 90% are what are called what's the English for this? Kyogi Rikon is mutually agreed upon divorces. So there's very little contestation in divorce. I mean that those divorces exist, but and often are related to custody arrangements. In most of the sort of mutually agreed upon divorces, the kyogyurikon, 80% of the time, mothers have sole custody of the child. I don't know, this is getting off topic, but the law has changed and now joint custody is an option as of this year. But at any rate, to answer the question very simply, I don't think divorce has gotten any easier over this period, but that's because it was already easy to start with, at least from a bureaucratic sort of registration perspective.
yeah, from a bureaucratic perspective, from the societal perspective, it
Yeah.
may become a little easier.
Oh, completely,
Yeah, yeah,
completely.
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm here to present data, but I don't have data on this. But I can tell you, the first time I went to Japan was probably about 40 years ago, and you people are eager to tell you about what Japan is like. We don't divorce, even if we're unhappy. We don't divorce, and a third, a fourth, half of people I know, or well, actually, that's too many, but a substantial proportion of people I know or people around me have divorced or are thinking about divorce. It's
So
it's it, it's common. Yeah.
let's go back to your data.
Mhm.
Christina wants you to tell us whether there
Yeah.
are any differences in terms of fertility, divorce, remarriage, and so forth and so on, according to the economic standing of
Yeah.
couples in Japan, or
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
also regional differences. So,
Yeah, regional differences is I don't have that in my back pocket. I wish I did. One thing that's interesting about Japan is that although regional differences certainly exist, they are far less pronounced than they might be, say, in the United States, which may be an extreme in the other direction with respect to regional variation. So I don't have that. I apologize. But I can absolutely say, with respect to the first part of the question, the answer is yes. And this is something that I've spent much of the past 15 or so years working on, trying to understand the socioeconomic differences. We usually measure this by educational attainment or occupation. Income's a little tricky for a variety of reasons that I think many people are well aware. But let's just take, for example, marriage. One of the first studies I ever did was looking at evaluating educational differences in women's marriage, and it was very clear that the highly educated women were the last to marry and the most likely to never marry, and that is flipped. They're still the last to marry. They marry later, and that's no surprise. That's true pretty much everywhere. But it was really quite surprising to us. A paper we published about 5 years ago showed that the long-standing difference between highly educated, university educated women and those with a high school education or less, that's flipped. And it's those with a high school education or less, women, that is, that are less likely to marry now. For men, that's always been the case, and that hasn't changed. That's just become more pronounced, the gap between highly educated men and women in terms of marriage. So this is really interesting, and we can talk about some of the reasons why that might be the case. But it's also true with respect to divorce. There's a very pronounced negative educational gradient in divorce. University educated women and men, there's a lot of homogamy, people marrying people of the same educational level, very unlikely to divorce relative to those with lower levels of education, much, much higher, several times higher for those with a high school education or less, with implications for the reproduction of disadvantage across generations, within and across generations.
And is that different in Japan from elsewhere?
No,
It's,
it's actually quite similar. There are some places where that's not the case. I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but the U.S. is since we're in the U.S., it's a good example. The U.S. is a place where these differences are profound, and the less educated, lower earning men and women couples behaving in increasingly different ways. And Japan, in some ways, mimics this. In other ways, it doesn't. The degree of bifurcation is not as strong in Japan as it is in the US, but there's a whole literature, if people listening are interested, associated with a sociologist called Sarah McClanahan. She coined this term diverging destinies, which is really about this bifurcation in family behavior in the United States and its implications for children's well-being and the sort of reproduction of disadvantage across generations. And one of the things we've been trying to do is to see whether this pattern is visible in Japan and other parts of East Asia. And as I just said, it's a bit of yes and a bit of no.
so as we're talking about societal change and
Hmm.
the ijime that used to come with not
Mm.
being the standard two children
Yeah.
family and we have two questions about
Hmm.
LGBTQ population and same-sex marriage.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that something that has popped up in the survey data? And then there's also, so there's one portion of this is sort of the Women's Day, seeing also sort of the feminist marriage refusal among women could explain some of
Hmm.
this, but also
Hmm.
gay men not marrying as they used to maybe in the old days, the opposite sex just for appearances
Yeah,
purposes.
yeah.
What do your data show about that?
My data don't show anything about that. So these are very, very good questions that people around me are extremely interested in and investing quite heavily in trying to understand. So a couple of things with the kind of data that I work with. I imagine you could probably piece something together with individual census data records by trying to match same sex two people of the same sex and roughly similar age, but unrelated to each other living together. You could probably piece together something. I don't know anybody who's done that. But in the kind of data that I use, which are sort of mid-size national surveys collected by the institute I introduced at the beginning, they don't ask these questions. But it's not because they're not interested, but I think it's because even if they did ask the questions, the prevalence of, say, LGBTQ groups or people is too small. You're going to end up with just a few people in a corner of the survey that you don't really have any, you can't do anything with because it doesn't lend itself to analysis. However, recognizing these problems, there are some places that have invested heavily in trying to do sort of targeted surveys over samples, which involve a very complicated process of actually identifying who fits into these different categories because there is no this isn't on your Koseki or anything like that. Of course, there's no, how do you sample? How do you sample groups like this? And it's really hard to do that. It's very easy to sample from Juminhyo type data, the Jumin Kihon Daicho. You can easily, generate national samples, but not based on characteristics that are unobservable in official records like this. But the city, I can't remember whether it was the city or prefecture of Osaka, did a large scale, very large scale survey of sexual minority populations in Osaka. And that has been the basis of much of what we know about these um, uh, groups and their demographic behavior. There's a young demographer, Hiramori Aiki is his name, and he's been writing quite a bit on this. With respect to same-sex marriage, I think many people are aware that is not legal in Japan. Japan is one of the few wealthy countries where that's not legal. But there are parts of Japan. I take Shibuya-ku for an example, where the city or the municipality, I should say, provides something like the French Pax or something like that. It's not an official marriage, but some form of recognition within the municipality. So there's that. And I forgot there was one more piece to this. What was the last piece of the question? I forgot the last piece of the
I
question.
guess whether
Oh, the feminist.
oh
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
right. So that's really quite an interesting question, and one that I have the great pleasure of, as somebody who studies Japan, being deeply immersed in the East Asian demography community and have many opportunities to present and talk with people doing work on China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea. And Japan, often we talk about the similarities with Korea, and this is one where Japan is just really quite different. The kind of sort of backlash or the so-called gender wars and the 4B movement and the Korean women saying no to marriage or even relationships. I don't see any evidence of that in Japan. I mean, I could be missing something. We don't they don't collect information. Well, actually, there is information collected on this. Do you want to marry? How do you feel about marriage? I definitely want to marry. I'd like to marry if possible. I'd like to marry if I meet the right person. Maybe later, but not now. These kinds of questions. The proportion of women and men in Japan who say nope, no interest is very small, single digits. And that's not the case in Korea.
I'm reminded of this old, was it AIG or AXA or one of those life insurance companies did this thing in the 1960s that many people know about, but they asked women in their marriage age, whatever that was at the time, early 20s, um,
Yeah,
and it was the three C, ka, kura, kara. So they wanted to marry someone who had an
yeah.
automobile, an air conditioner, and a color TV, and so
The Sanshiro Zingi.
and then
Yeah,
over
yeah,
the years, this questionnaire was continued, and then it became the three highs, right?
yeah.
High,
Sanko. Yeah,
sei ga takai, kyuru ga takai
yeah,
is a high
yeah, yeah.
salary and high education. And then at the turn of the century, it became they have to the guys. So they're asking women, right? The men have to be. He has to be interesting. And I thought that's really hard. I mean, I can be a salaryman. I can buy a television of it, but I feel sorry for these guys. It got to be interesting. That is a whole different ballpark, right? So, and I think
Yeah,
that's what we see in Japan, that women saying, I'm not going to marry if it is not, I'm not going to do one of these Nakodo setup, arranged
Yeah,
marriages. I want to
yeah,
really be in love, and that's difficult, man. So we got
yeah,
some questions from the audience about the policies. You mentioned that Japan has really great policies in terms of married couples having it
yeah.
easier to, the whole daycare
Yes,
bottleneck
exactly.
has been removed. And so for married couples having children now is actually, it's a pretty well set up thing. And the large
Mhm.
companies at least also have good policies in place. Um, but the question is whether what kind of policies you see from your research that have worked, and are there
Mhm.
policies to encourage remarriage and sort of kind of deal with that issue of people are not married or divorced and therefore they don't have children. So are there any initiatives to address the issue that you have identified as the main issue?
Yeah. So that I have three things to say on that. I'll start with the easiest one. And I'm not aware of anything that would fall under the broad heading of remarriage policy or policies that even have remarriage in their sites. And I think that's related to something I mentioned probably just briefly in passing, if I didn't forget. And that is that I think, even if divorce is more widely recognized and understood as being relevant for these issues, remarriage has kind of gone under the radar. I don't quite know how 25% of marriages fly under the radar, but there is really exceedingly little written at a population level on these issues, remarriage behavior, and I don't know any policies that would be directly related to that. One response is that in many cases, remarriages are a lot like first marriages. The most common pairing, I didn't have time to show it for remarriages, is formerly married men and never married women, which, given that women have typically sole custody of the children from the previous marriage, means the guys are childless and the women are more or less by definition childless. So these are couples that might be responsive to the same kinds of policies that first married couples might be responsive to. So on that point, I don't know that there isn't any research that I'm aware of. There's plenty of research that seeks to evaluate different policies like flex time, like on-site daycare, access to daycare, increases in child subsidy, child allowances, changes in school costs, the elimination of school costs in certain contexts on childbearing within marriage. But I don't know of any policies, any evaluations of policies that might affect people who are contemplating marriage and having children. Two thoughts on that. One, I think we can look to other countries to see what kinds of policies or what kinds of policy environments have been linked to marriage or family formation more generally. And one is housing subsidies. So the ability to transition to independence. And another that I think is particularly salient in the Japanese case and is related to things that we've talked about already is some kind of policy that addresses the absolute lack of protection that many employees have at young ages in the sort of what we might call bad jobs, crappy jobs, dead end jobs, the non-standard employment that many find themselves in. This is much more important for men for the reasons you mentioned earlier than it is for women. But I think those are two that I would focus on. And then just for what it's worth, I'm not trying to advertise my work because A, it's not published yet, and B, I don't do that normally. But we're trying to understand whether or not there might be some spillover effect. So, to the extent that young people interested, as I said, in marrying and forming a family, are aware of what the policies are for targeting couples, that may have a kind of indirect spillover effect. And there's some evidence from survey-based experiments that this is actually true, but it's really hard to evaluate. But we're working on it.
I think you have a PhD student at Princeton who's looking at was something about regional governments putting together like Match.com kind of websites to help
Um,
people get married or something, which sounded like an interesting
yes.
role for the government.
Yeah, that actually, so that's good. Thank you, Ulrika. That is a policy that has been implemented. And it's a postdoc, I think, Anna Vosny, who is that's sort of what she did her dissertation research on at Michigan. And it's quite interesting. So one thing I didn't mention from the data, there's a lot of things we don't know from the data, but one thing we do know from the data is that the role of matching appli, the matching sites or applications or dating marriage facilitating services are playing a much more important role in providing connections, a place to meet. The survey has asked for decades, where did you meet your spouse? And in very recent years, there's been a real sharp uptick in people who say matching appli or something like that. So there is that. The interesting thing about that as a policy, though, is so there's two things to this, and I apologize if I'm getting too far in the weeds, but I want to do justice to Anna's work on this. One is that, whenever governments get involved in things like trying to, you know, match couples, that's generally, I think, not well received. It's not cool. However, there are many, widely used, well thought of, popular sites or apps for this or services for this. And her work really, I think, tries to make the case that even if the government sort of fails in its own direct efforts, is really trying to facilitate the development of these services in a way to sort of indirectly support not policies but private solutions to the dating market issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I heard that, I thought, well, why would the government? Why not the private market? But
Yeah.
so final question. Uh,
Mhm.
uh, I don't know what demographers see. I'm wondering whether there's a more, I mean, how often do you see a big change? And the reason I'm thinking
Mhm.
that things might
Yeah.
change, there are two things. One goes back to the initial question about the ice age and the bad job situation at the turn of the century, sort of undermining, I don't know, causing too much uncertainty for people to get married. But the current labor shortage, right? I just looked at the job opening to job applicant ratio, and it's
Yeah. Yeah.
2.7 in Japan. There are
Yeah.
three jobs for
Yeah.
everybody graduating from the university,
Yeah. Yeah.
and there are 1.7 jobs for everybody who already has a job.
Yeah.
And then there was a question from the audience. There's of course the rising number of immigrants. So the question is it possible that this trend will reverse in significant ways very soon?
Good. That's a great question. I mean, that's a question that if the answer were yes, the government would be ecstatic. Um, Employers would be ecstatic. But I think, I mean, a couple of things on this. I think in the long run, things will absolutely change. But I think the long run. You ask what demographers see. We don't see that far into the future. But on that point, what was I going to say? So if we look at other countries that have experienced similar declines in fertility, maybe I'm thinking particularly of Southern Europe and Northern European, Western European countries. Um, there's never ever been an example of a country that has fallen below replacement level fertility for some period of time, I don't arbitrarily 10 years or so, and recovered to replacement. It's never happened. There have been shorter term bumps up and down, policy related bumps, but in terms of recovering from a long period, Japan's got 50 years, as I said, that would be unprecedented. I think it will happen, but I don't think it's going to happen like that. Demography unfolds on a longer time scale, and it would have to be a seismic change. Um, maybe here's I'm just going to throw out something since we have no time and I've got nothing to lose. But um, AI. I mean, AI could completely alter the work environment in ways that result in a much higher standard of living, a shift in the so-called male work culture, which we might think is often perceived as a barrier to family formation. So there might be something on that. I mean, I simply don't know enough. I don't think anybody knows enough about what that future looks like to make any kind of informed projections. But if there's a massive shock change on the horizon, that's the only thing I can think of.
Well, we'll just have to stick around long enough to see it. Not today, however. Our time
No,
is
no.
up. Thank you very much, Professor Jim Raymo from Princeton. It was wonderful. Thank you for joining us, and it was just a terrific tour de force through this topic. And audience, thank you for sticking with us through this hour, and we'll see you again on April 14th with a zooming out on whether private equity is bringing to Japan more problems than it's worth, which actually may be the case. We will see. It may also clean up some things that need to be cleaned up. So we'll look forward to that discussion. And thank you, Jim, again. And audience, thanks. And have a wonderful day, evening, week.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.